Hello everyone, good morning. Welcome back to another Tuesday morning of Reading with Raptors. I'm Kelsey and I'm here in our program room with one of our resident great horned owls we call Samantha. We're going to be reading a really delightful little storybook called Owl Moon. This one is by Jane Yolen and illustrated by John, I think it's Schoenherr. Apologies if that's not correct. Schoenherr, I think is how you pronounce that. And so this one is really nice and I thought was really fitting for today since it was just the winter solstice yesterday. So we are just actually beginning winter. I know it maybe doesn't feel like it since we've been having some kind of wintry weather for a while now, up here in Minnesota at least. But technically we are now in winter. So I figured this was a really nice kind of book to hopefully get us off on the right track of some great outdoor owl listening, bird watching, good fun times out in the snow for those of us who get lots of snow or are kind of waiting for some of that snow here, like we are up here in Minnesota at least. So without too much further ado, I will say I put in the description for this video, I put a link to a page where if you are interested in some maybe last minute end of the year gifts, we have our gift store, and then the link that I put in is also for sponsoring one of our education birds, since that we kind of changed how we do that. So it's a lot of really, really cool kind of benefits to sponsoring a raptor. So definitely check that out if you are interested in giving a kind of a close-up and personal experience with a bird to someone that you know who's very interested in birds and wildlife. So check that out. Otherwise, let's get started here. I will say too, for anyone who joined us last week and saw some of the technical difficulties, this is the first time that I am doing this on our new tablet. So I'm really excited. I can see the chat really nicely on this. So if I'm poking around at the screen, that is why I'm really excited. So let's get started. This is Owl Moon. Here's the first page, which already has this delightful illustration on it of a child looking out through the doorway at that beautiful winter weather. Here we open up on this kind of farm scene, big open kind of flat area, looks like maybe a mountain in the background, and we have this kind of older farmhouse, kind of looks like with some kind of stone foundation, big open fields. It was late one winter night, long past my bedtime, when Pa and I went owling. There was no wind, the trees stood still as giant statues, and the moon was so bright the sky seemed to shine. Somewhere behind us, a train whistle blew, long and low, like a sad, sad song. There's that train out here in the background. You can just see the little bit of kind of steam coming out of it. So here we have our main character and Pa walking outside. Sorry, I think I skipped a page. We're good. There you go. I could hear it through the woolen cap Pa had pulled down over my ears. A farm dog answered the train, and then a second dog joined in. They sang out, trains and dogs, for a real long time. And when their voices faded away, it was as quiet as a dream. We walked on towards the woods, Pa and I. Here's this kind of nice path, this low kind of stone wall. Here's the forest. It looks like we have a tiny fox actually down here, down near the kind of snow. I think there's a tiny little creature poking its head out from inside the hole in this tree. Wonder what that is. Maybe we'll find out. Our feet crunched over the crisp snow and little gray footprints followed us. Pa made a long shadow, but mine was short and round. I had to run after him every now and then to keep up, and my short, round shadow bumped after me. But I never called out. If you go owling, you have to be quiet. That's what Pa always says. I had been waiting to go owling with Pa for a long, long time. So here we have this beautiful kind of snowy expanse. Here's some trees. Here are those footsteps following them through the snow. Here's Pa's long shadow and our main character's short shadow. They follow after a few little birds up in the trees. We reached the line of pine trees, black and pointy against the sky, and Pa held up his hand. I stopped right where I was and waited. He looked up as if searching the stars, as if reading a map up there. The moon made his face into a silver mask. Then he called, "Hoo, hoo, 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 hoo," the sound of a great horned owl. Hoo, 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 hoo. Here you can see the Pa standing here making that hooting sound. Our main character all bundled up next to him. This beautiful line of kind of pine evergreen trees. There's one tree that's actually fallen down here, and there's a tiny little mouse or something down here on the ground. Maybe listening to that owl sound. Sorry, fingers don't want to cooperate with the pages. There we go. Again, he called out, and then again. After each call, he was silent, and for a moment, we both listened. But there was no answer. Pa shrugged, and I shrugged. I was not disappointed. My brothers all said sometimes there's an owl, and sometimes there isn't. Here we have this big tree. In the hole in the tree, I think this is a raccoon. You can see the little kind of dark mask over its eyes. So hiding up in that tree, staying nice and warm and hidden. So here we have our two characters, listening, waiting. See if they can hear that great horned owl calling back. We walked on. I could feel the cold, as if someone's icy hand was palm down on my back. And my nose and the tops of my cheeks felt cold and hot at the same time. But I never said a word. If you go owling, you have to be quiet and make your own heat. So here we have our characters tromping along. You see this beautiful big expanse of snow out in the kind of rural country area. Big, dense trees, kind of pine forest. Kind of main character tromping through the snow. Kind of deep, looks like it's kind of up to the top of their boots, almost to their knees. Actually, since people are pointing out what this bird looks like, you can see this great horned owl who is reading with us today is from really far up north where it's snowy like this for most of the year with lots of really light colored trees. You can see why this great horned owl would have been really well camouflaged up hunting in those kind of northern areas with lots of snow, huh? Which kind of matches that camouflage. We went into the woods. The shadows were the blackest things I had ever seen. They stained the white snow. My mouth felt furry, for the scarf over it was wet and warm. I didn't ask what kinds of things hide behind black trees in the middle of the night. When you go owling, you have to be brave. So here we have our characters holding hands in the woods as they walk. You can see these big, dark woods, these really big trees. You can see them stretching here. These tiny lines are the trunks of trees out in the distance. So you can see some pretty kind of dense forest that they're walking through. You can see why that might be kind of scary at night. Hopefully some of you have been able to go out walking in some nice, dark, deep, dark woods at night. I always love it. Then we came to a clearing in the dark woods. The moon was high above us. It seemed to fit exactly over the center of the clearing, and the snow below it was whiter than the milk in a cereal bowl. You can see this nice big clearing. You can see the deep, dark woods all around, this big, open, white clearing. And what is this? There's a deer hiding down close to a tree, nestled into the snow, keeping very still and quiet. I sighed, and Pa held up his hand. Oh, wait, I'm sorry, I might have missed. Nope. Sorry, I misunderstood. All right. I sighed, and Pa held up his hand at the sound. I put my mittens over the scarf over my mouth and listened hard. And then Pa called, hoo-hoo, hoo, 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 hoo. I listened and looked so hard my ears hurt and my eyes got cloudy with the cold. Pa raised his face to call out again, but before he could open his mouth, an echo came threading its way through the trees. Hoo, hoo, hoo. You could see our main character trying so hard to stay quiet while Pa is calling to that owl. And what is this noise that's coming back? Pa almost smiled. Then he called back, hoo, 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 just as if he and the owl were talking about supper, or the woods, or the moon, or the cold. I took my mitten off the scarf, off my mouth, and I almost smiled too. You can see our two surprised characters here, trying to figure out where that sound is coming from. They're in the woods. The owl's call came closer, from high up in the trees on the edge of the meadow. Nothing in the meadow moved. All of a sudden, an owl shadow, part of the big tree shadow, lifted off and flew right over us. We watched silently with heat in our mouths, the heat of all those words we had not spoken. The shadow hooted again. Here we have this big woods. You can see that big clearing. This big tree, our tiny characters here. And up here, kind of floating through that dark sky, you can see the owl swooping over to a tree. Pa turned on his big flashlight and caught the owl just as it was landing on a branch. You can see that big kind of rounded wingspan, those fluffy feathers. You can see the feet kind of coming down to land here. I love that they included how owl feet work. They usually land with their 2 toes in the front and the 2 in the back, just like these are. This is a beautiful illustration. You can see our 2 characters down here looking so excited and surprised to see this owl. For 1 minute, 3 minutes, maybe even 100 minutes, we stared at one another. You can see that great horned owl, that big kind of white kind of bib almost. We call it a gular patch, but that big white patch underneath its neck, those big rounded wings, those giant talons and feet. You can actually see, especially in comparison, these 2 owls next to each other. This one looks like what we see a lot more kind of down here in kind of the southern part of Minnesota and the rest of the US, compared to our very light colored great horned owl here, who's really light in color, kind of like a very light color. And then here's more kind of a tan and brown great horned owl from kind of further south down here. You might see a little bit more often. Then the owl pumped its great wings and lifted off the branch like a shadow without sound. It flew back into the forest. "Time to go home," Pa said to me. I knew then I could talk. I could even laugh out loud. But I was a shadow as we walked home. Here we can see this great horned owl swooping away using those big broad wings, using those big eyes and big round face to listen, figure out where it's going. You can see our characters down here watching it leave. There's a tiny little, I think it's probably a squirrel or something, tucked into the hole in this tree, watching that owl leave very carefully. When you go owling, you don't need words or warm or anything but hope. That's what Pa says. The kind of hope that flies on silent wings under a shining owl moon. You can see our characters there walking home back to that farmhouse out of the woods. So that was, here, I'll show you the back of this book because the whole book cover is really pretty. You can see our two characters walking through the snow. So this was Owl Moon by Jane Yolen and illustrated by John Schoenherr. Schoenherr? I think Schoenherr. So this was Owl Moon. Thank you all for joining us for reading that. I was gonna quick scroll back and see if people had any questions in the chat about either our book or our great horned owl here. I will say too, I really enjoy this book. Like I said, hopefully at least some of us here have had a chance to kind of go out and walk around kind of in those winter woods. I don't know, it was a lot of like really good memories as I was looking through this book. So hopefully if that's something you've never gotten to do, hopefully you do this year. If you live in an area that gets this kind of nice, cold, still winter nights, always really fun. You know, we have great horned owls that live near us, since you can find them in the cities, in the suburbs, out in the country, really all over North, Central, and South America. You can find great horned owls. So really common species. If you're listening for them a lot right now, they're going to start making a lot more noise as we get into kind of the actual winter, now that we're technically in winter. Usually, at least up here in kind of northern parts of the US, up here in Minnesota, we usually start seeing and hearing them start to make a lot of their kind of territorial and nesting calls as we get into kind of late into December and into January, since often they will actually nest and lay eggs as early as February. So they nest really early on in the year. So if you want to be trying to spot them and figure out where they are, actually being outside and listening, especially kind of around sunrise and sunset, when it's dark but there's maybe a little bit of light out, is when you are most likely to see and hear them. You can hear them kind of all different times of the night, but usually around sunrise and sunset is usually the best time to be hearing great horned owls. Keeping an eye on those. Just scrolling through, make sure I didn't miss any questions. Some fans of the great horned owl sounds, which is excellent. Sorry, I pressed a button that I shouldn't have. There you go. Make sure that I didn't miss any. Oh, what makes the owl flight so silent? A great question. So the main thing is actually the structure of the owl feathers themselves. You can actually see this under a microscope. You can even see it just kind of if you look at an owl feather in person. The tops of their feathers, especially on those flight feathers, but all their feathers have this kind of extra layer of almost kind of fuzz on them. So feathers are, they look like just kind of one big solid object, but they're made of lots of tiny strands that kind of all hook together. So we call them barbs and barbules, and then little hooks that kind of hook together. On the tops of those feathers, there's this little kind of layer of fuzz that sticks out that feels kind of like almost a really soft velvety kind of texture, and it breaks up the wind resistance. So it makes owls a little bit slower than a lot of other birds because it's not really letting them cut through the air as well. But it prevents their feathers from kind of sliding against each other and making that noise, and kind of prevents that kind of whipping noise that you hear when something solid kind of cuts through the air. So it makes them really, really quiet. The way that they actually fly is they often are not doing a lot of flapping when they're hunting. They'll usually be sitting up on a tree or some other kind of tall perch, looking down at the ground, and then they stick out their wings and kind of swoop down. So they do not as much kind of flapping as a lot of other birds do. So they'll kind of swoop down and grab onto their food that way. So that also helps them be extra sneaky and quiet. Oh, really good question. Can owls fly in the rain? It's a really good question. I guess it would depend kind of on how rainy it is. Usually most birds, you don't really see out flying very much during the rain. Makes it kind of tricky for them to be flying, especially if they're really kind of getting soaked through. So the feathers are, kind of because of the structure of them, they are already kind of inherently waterproof. Kind of the structure of how all those little hooks kind of hook together really helps them repel water. So if you take a feather and you kind of spray a little bit of water on it, you can see it kind of beating up and holding onto the surface. But if they're kind of out in too much water, they can get really, really wet, really kind of soggy and waterlogged. So it takes a little bit to dry out. So a lot of times you won't see too many birds out flying when it's actually raining. Probably doesn't help. That gets kind of hard to see when you're out flying in the rain, things like that. So usually if it's raining, they'll kind of hunker down. But usually if they're able to stay dry, they can swoop to different trees if they need to. But yeah, usually you won't see too many birds out flying when it's raining. So they might be able to move around a little bit, but usually prefer to not, just because if they do get pretty soaked, they have to dry out a little bit. Those feathers can get pretty wet if they're out in really heavy rain, especially, or kind of flying through it. Kind of like if you go running out in the rain, you get extra wet compared to if you kind of stay kind of slow and walk along. I can imagine flying through the rain would be pretty soaking. Any other last questions about great horned owls? Like I said, this particular great horned owl is from northern Minnesota, up kind of near Canada. So you can see that wonderful camouflage that would really help her to blend in. So pretty unusual. She's also a bit larger than what we normally see of kind of our kind of more typical kind of mid-continental great horned owls. Like most birds, they do tend to get bigger the further north you go. So she is kind of on the larger end of great horned owls that we see here at the Raptor Center. Usually if we see any great horned owls who are larger than she is, they're usually of the kind of similar, really far northern, kind of subarctic kind of color pattern that we see. So usually they need that kind of extra bulk to help stay warm. You want to have kind of a bigger body mass compared to your surface area. So kind of a bigger owl stays warmer more easily. And then they also have lots of kind of extra fluffy layers. So a lot of these feathers kind of down here, this kind of whole chunk of feathers, so I'm trying to like align my hand in front of her, but this kind of whole chunk of feathers down here are feathers that are kind of overlaying the top of her legs. And they really are, it's a huge kind of clump of feathers that kind of help to, they kind of round out the shape, the kind of owl shape, but they're really helping to keep a lot of warm air in. Kind of like having snow pants built in. So she has lots of fluffy feathers to keep her toasty warm. Oh, really good question. How long do they tend to stay in an area? Kind of depends on the owl and the area. You might have great horned owls living in the same area and kind of nesting and then kind of leaving the nest and staying in the general territory. They can be there all year round. So great horned owls, again, with those fluffy warm feathers, with the feathers on their feet, kind of like nice built-in work boots, with their ability to hear and kind of find small animals underneath the snow, means that they can really be hunting, even in really cold climates. They can be living and hunting in the same area year round, as long as there's enough food. So they might actually be in the same area all year. And you might not notice, just because they can be so sneaky and quiet, that if you're not able to see them or hear them for most of the year, they can really kind of sneak around. So it's really hard to kind of spot them. I will say, if you are trying to look for great horned owls really year round, the best way is actually to listen for crows or blue jays. What you'll see and hear are a big group of these small birds all kind of flying around a tree pretty frantically, and you'll be hearing a lot of really loud kind of that yelling kind of vocalization, kind of really like sharp kind of vocalizations. I can do owl noises. I'm not very good at crow or jay noises, so but you'll see them and you'll kind of get the impression of just like a lot of frantic activity. If you watch those trees, a lot of times, if you keep an eye out, you'll see a great horned owl or even a red-tailed hawk come flying out of that tree. Since those smaller birds know that these top predator birds can be very dangerous, especially for these great horned owls, who will often hunt and eat those smaller birds while they are kind of roosting in their tree at night. So they know if these owls are around, they might be in danger. So those birds want to get these owls out of here. And those other larger raptors, you'll often see this, somebody pointed out with eagles, that's how they find eagles as well. So eagles and red-tailed hawks especially. I'll sometimes see it with Cooper's hawks. The Cooper's hawks usually leave a lot quicker, I think, than the red-tails or the great horns tend to do. But yeah, that's usually how I'll find them. So it's a very interesting kind of crow and blue jay social behavior called mobbing, which is exactly what it sounds like. They all gang up on the owl and try to get it out of there. So it's usually the best way to spot them if you're kind of keeping an eye out for them year round, since they are so tricky to see and hear. Since she does have her head, since she does have her head turned, you can still see that she's moving her head around. You can see that really big facial disc. So she has those giant eyes. Actually, if we were a great horned owl, so like if I was a great horned owl, my eyes would be about this big, about the size of my fist. So they have these huge eyes for seeing really well in those low light conditions. They also have really big ears. Now they have those tufts of feathers on their heads. Those are kind of for camouflage, for helping them blend in. Her actual ears are kind of underneath these black lines on the sides of her face. That is the edge of her facial disc. So all those kind of flat, kind of stiff feathers that kind of are arranged away from her eyes are funneling sound towards her ears. So her ears are actually big holes on the sides of her head. So most of her actual skull underneath those fluffy feathers, it's mostly taken up by her beak, her big eyes, and big holes for her ears. So she's really able to both see and hear really well, which helps those great horned owls out in the wild for finding all of their prey. I will also say too, you can see her turning her head around. We just heard, I heard some small falcon noises from next door. Somebody's probably working with one of our smaller falcons. So you can see her kind of turning her head and listening to that. So owls can turn their heads extra far, even compared to other birds. So we can turn our heads about a quarter of the way around. So about from looking straight forward to kind of looking over one shoulder. Most birds can turn their heads about 180 degrees or halfway around a circle, which means that they can look straight behind them. But owls, because of how big their eyes are, can't actually move their eyeballs at all. So they can't roll their eyes in big circles like we can. They need to be able to turn their whole head. So they can turn their heads extra far, so they can look, turn their head in one direction and end up looking over their opposite shoulder. So about 3/4 of the way around a circle, or 270 degrees. So they're able to turn their heads extra far. They're able to do this because they have really flexible connections between the bones of their spine and their skull. We have a much more sturdy connection, but not as flexible. They also, underneath all those fluffy feathers, they have twice as many neck bones as we do. We are mammals, so we have 7 bones in the neck portion of our spine. She has 14, she has twice as many. So she actually has a very long, very flexible neck underneath all those fluffy feathers. So very important for owls with those big eyes to be able to turn their heads really far around to see what's going on around them. So as you're watching her kind of turning her head, that is what she's able to do. All right, I don't see any last questions about our great horned owls. So thank you all so much for joining me here for our kind of kicking off the winter reading with Raptors. Like I was saying earlier, if you missed it, if you check out the link in the description of the video, if you know anybody who might be interested in another kind of close-up personal experience with one of the Raptors here at the Raptor Center, you can check out the link to sponsor a Raptor to help support our education birds, the birds who live here permanently full-time, like Sam, the great horned owl here. Otherwise, everyone, enjoy the start of your winter. I know it's going to get pretty chilly up here in the upper Midwest. Hopefully everyone else watching is going to stay plenty warm as we finally get into the winter times up here, at least in the northern hemisphere. Otherwise, we will see you all again next week for more Reading with Raptors. So stay safe and warm until then. Have a great day, everyone.